the standards of writing for young people from 100 years ago will knock your socks off. And we tend to think it must be because the language is staid or dated that it's hard for us to understand. But even a modern sort of translation is more than most people have an appetite for. That's partly because we've killed their love of learning through the school system. And it benefits the school system to do this, right? Curious isn't good. Receptive is good. You will be supplied what you need. Don't go looking for it. The system that teaches people to relate to knowledge that way is not on their team, right? Those people do not want the better of you. And maybe that's part of why the standards fall. I don't want to go full conspiracy theory, that the system doesn't want you to write well or think well, that the state dumbs down education and censors information deliberately to weaken people's minds and to empower itself as the provider of right and good. But it doesn't hurt. It hasn't hurt them. Because if you can write well, really well, you can change minds. Minds change social conditions. They rise up against bad ideas. They challenge structures. As much lip service as we pay to overthrowing the system in education, it isn't in the educational system's interest to provide you with the tools to do that. Writing a new reality in this really literal sense, it makes sense that we don't set up schools to do that anymore. It doesn't benefit the system to teach people to question it.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Laura Williams. Laura is currently the managing editor at the American Institute for Economic Research. She has a PhD in English, and she's been working as a ghostwriter and an editor for years now. I've had the chance of working very closely with Laura as both my editor and also with Laura as a contributor to Renegade Educator, where she's written a number of articles on different schooling models and the history of education in America. I invited Laura on today to talk about the importance of writing in education and why, in a world with short form social media content and AI taking over the practice of writing altogether, why teaching kids how to write well is still important. And Laura made a compelling case. She talked about using writing as a form of self-authoring. She talked about using it to build your credibility with the outside world as a tool for formulating and honing your own thinking, and as a way of inserting yourself into the historical conversation around ideas that so many of the people we look up to have partaken in, but that it's not always intuitive that we ourselves can be a part of. And Laura talked about the importance of teaching that to students as a habit that they can take with them into the rest of their lives. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to Laura. We had a ton of fun recording this episode, and I hope you enjoy listening. Laura Williams, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back.
I am so excited to do this. I've had a number of conversations that have been tangential to writing over the course of, honestly, the past few months on the podcast, because so many things come back to it as a sort of tangential point. Either people are talking about the rise of AI and how that's going to affect whether or not kids are doing any writing in school anymore because they can just cheat now, which opens up the can of worms of if your kids aren't writing in school, but they're also not going to write in the real world because they can also use AI for all of that. Is it even important?
Is there a meaningful concept of cheating when it comes to reproducing the thoughts in your own mind, or is that imposed by school?
Ooh, we could start there if you have an answer to that question.
Yes, if you have designed an assignment that kids can use AI to cheat at, they should, because you've designed the assignment poorly. They were already not required to use any independent thought to create this. and so they can have it done by robot. But that is the failure of imagination of the assignment if you are able to cheat it. And what skills are we trying to develop? The whole idea of a closed book test is an extremely artificial idea that isn't present very many places in the real world. You can generally have the resources that would make your life easier, um, and the need to test it in isolation without collaborator or source is imposed by the school system's desire to test whether you have learned what you've been taught, not how well your mind works.
Well, isn't part of the argument that you can give a child a very specific essay prompt, share your thoughts after reading these 3 books or on this specific book that you read. Tell me what you thought about the Grapes of Wrath or how it relates back, the themes relate back to your experience or something like that. And because AI is advanced enough, they can still drop it into ChatGPT or Claude, and the AI can just make up something that still feels identical to something a student who's sort of I don't want to say mechanical writer because that sounds very harsh, but like a writer that just hasn't really tapped into that
Developing
soulfulness of
writer. Yeah.
personality and personal flair would be writing anyway. And to a teacher, it may be hard to spot the difference between those two things. And the argument is that, well, the child should have taken the time to think about this and written it because it would have been beneficial, but AI enables the cheating of that. You're saying that's a bad assignment to begin with?
Is there no impetus on the teacher to create something worth thinking about? If the Grapes of Wrath is so unrelatable that you would rather turn in something made up, first of all, it shows you that the grade is the important part, that the
Mm-hmm.
student has not, in fact, learned any value in reading and analyzing literature through the lens of their own experience. They don't have any interest in doing that. That seems like a failure of teaching. Um, so, given that that was not their perception of the purpose of the writing task, the purpose of the writing task is to supply something agreeable enough to the teacher that you get a passing grade, then yes, that can be done with AI. But maybe The Grapes of Wrath was a bad pick. It's a bad pick. It's a bad book.
I actually liked it, but we can debate that later.
If you read it as an adult, you might feel differently.
That's true. I did read it in high school. Goes downstairs. I'll be back in like 5 hours. I have to go review my copy downstairs so we can resume this.
If you don't a little bit like the Catcher in the Rye at 20, you're not going to be a very interesting person, and if you still love it at 50, you're probably not a very interesting person. These things change as they are informed by our experience.
So then what, and you may or may not have an answer to this, but what in your mind constitutes a good assignment that is either difficult or impossible to cheat on using AI, or is interesting enough that ideally a student doesn't want to cheat on it because they want to have the experience of doing the thing because it is inherently compelling to them?
Right. So if you are hoping to cultivate a love of literature, mass assigning a single text and then asking people to relate to it is not a great way to do that. If literature functions as equipment for living, a way to relate to people whose experiences we've never had, and also to recognize the universality of our own experiences when we see them in someone else's words from 100 years ago. I would like to think that there are ways to engage young people, and not 30 at a time. It can't be done. But there are ways to engage people in the interest of literature that maybe does not constitute responding to a 100-year-old novel that should be broadly applicable to people your age as determined by a national curriculum standard that may not have any relevance to your life.
Which, by that standard, Grapes of Wrath is not a good choice. I will absolutely concede.
Oh,
If
imposing it on people at the same point in their lives? Like,
well,
this
in
will be
general, I'm
relevant.
not a fan of that, but it's also not terribly relatable. I'm imagining the application of this being something like an individual who's introducing a student to a love of literature and the powerful tool that is literature, meeting the student where they are at and assigning them something that either answers a question that they have or relates to an experience that they're having, something that feels
Or put a child
personally.
in a library and see what speaks to them. It doesn't have to be dictated to them. If you have confidence that, in fact, a love of literature is a fundamental part of being human, you can convey that without compelling it. Students will find something to love in a library. I think it's Ta-Nehisi Coates who draws the distinction between the love of the library and the love of the classroom. One is what, you have access to the world of knowledge and you set your own path, and the other is someone deciding for you what you shall learn today and then judging you.
Do you think that if a child is given access to a library and they're given space and time to go through the mazes of shelves and find books that jump out at them and sit down and read them, that that child will develop a love of reading? Or do you think that there are other elements that are important in cultivating an appreciation
I
of
think you can
literature?
do a lot to cultivate an appreciation. I think it's also maybe unrealistic to assume that all children as adults will find the reading of literature really compelling. I don't read a lot of fiction as an adult. I read a lot, but I don't read a lot of fiction. Some people, would say that it's a shortcoming of the soul, but there are also people who were born to be chemists and they see the whole world through the lens of chemistry and they don't understand why everyone's not as excited about chemistry as they are. And if you have that kid, it's possible that trying to force them to love reading fiction is a losing battle. That's just not how their brain works. And as much as, this is the curse of all professors, of course, we think our specialties are the most important thing in the world and that no one can live a complete life without sharing our love of our specialty. But there are, in fact, other ways to be human than just to be an English professor. Those ways are not scored particularly well on standardized tests, which are written by people who largely conform to that one idea of what academic success means. We're the ones who did it well. That's how we got there. And it's probably not applicable to every kid. Writing, on the other hand, really is required of and relevant to every mind who wants to do something interesting in the world, including that kid who's obsessed with chemistry. Maybe he'll never learn to love classic literature, but he better learn to write well, or he's not going to get any grants, and he's not going to get good jobs, and he's not going to be able to convey how excited he is about chemistry and the results of whatever new research he's doing to people who otherwise don't have access to those ideas. The task of writing really is innately human in a way that maybe reading literature is not.
Let's go back to the AI example again, where a student is given an assignment and maybe it's not tied to a book. Maybe it's tied to something that they're learning in class, something that is intended to replicate the relationship between learning something and then putting it out in the world, or having an objective that you want to attain and using writing as the vehicle to make forward progress. A student has an assignment, they don't see the value in doing the writing, or they're just looking to be efficient. They'd much rather go hang out with their friends or work on a project or work on their, like, go do yard work for the neighbor and make money for it rather than sit down and write an essay that they know nobody's going to read anyway. So,
And no one wants to read. That's key, right?
mhm,
You don't have an actual audience for a student
yes.
essay.
Yes, but they use the tool available to them, which is AI. They have AI either write the article for them entirely, or they have it write it in part, and then they take it and edit it and make it sound like them, but in a much shorter amount of time. And then they go about their day. They turn in that assignment. they operate under the assumption that for a lot of the other writing they're going to do in the future, to whatever extent they're thinking about the future at all, AI will still be available and they can keep replicating this ad infinitum whenever they need to write something. What is being lost when that happens? If they live in a world where AI will always be available to them as a tool.
Yeah, maybe not much. There is a lot of critical thinking capacity of putting yourself through the process of refining your own work. And I think that has value, and in the sense that you want your writing to do something interesting. Refining how a tool works so that it produces the effect that you want is worth investing in. But for the examples that we've been given, it isn't a tool for anything except getting a grade. It doesn't have an audience. It doesn't have a purpose. It's very hard to get energy behind that. One of the beautiful things about AI is that you can write an interesting paragraph and then have 4 more versions generated quickly for you. What if I were addressing this to a reading level of 5th grade? What if I were addressing this to people without a background in chemistry? What if I were, and you can see how those pieces work together in a much more fast and concentrated way. As far as the skills, the scholastic skills that are lost, that is the same complaint that we see throughout history, right? Aristotle's worried that his students will get lazy because they can write things down and read them later. All the way up through someone who would say that my PhD is invalid because I did it in the age of keyword search. Well, can you really call yourself a PhD scholar if you didn't do it by card catalog with note cards? I happen to think you can, but the tools have not changed the essential task, nor the skills required to do it really well. It will change the teaching of it, but I think there are few things for which AI will not change the way we learn.
One of the things that you said that I think is really important is that when you're a student in a classroom writing an essay for class, there is this implicit assumption that you are writing it for an audience of one.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully one person, your teacher, who's going to read it and judge your academic performance based off of it and is going to report your academic performance to all of the other stakeholders in your education that you didn't choose to be stakeholders, most of them. And that's the extent of its value. It is merely being written for the goal of getting a stamp of approval, which is not true for most of the real world applications for writing.
Right.
And so there's a
Annual
disconnect here.
reports. That's the academic assignment of the adult world, is the annual report that must exist and must be readable. But we don't actually expect anyone to read it. And we're not entirely sure what the purpose is of producing it.
But kids are learning how to read, or sorry, learning how to write with this implicit assumption that people aren't going to read their stuff anyway. And they're writing in a format that they probably can sense, even if they don't explicitly know, is not a format that really exists in the real world. And so there's already a disconnect here in how we're teaching kids how to write. We're not teaching kids how to write well,
No. And we're
ever.
not giving them any impetus to try to write better, especially the B plus writer. Why should they get significantly better if there is no purpose to refining their work? Whereas if you have some young people write, a letter about something they really care about to some audience that could actually do something about it, now we have a concrete audience, we have a purpose, we have a value in making the argument as compelling as possible, in presenting oneself well and professionally with the use of vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar, all the things that feel like artificial rules imposed from the outside on the young writer in school, are tools that they can use if they've bought into the purpose. that they also care about producing high quality writing and not just getting a grade. But we've so divorced the purpose driven nature of why people actually write to one another and why people read, including teachers, right? We hope that they don't just toss them down the stairs and the ones that land closest to the bottom get an A. But the teachers have also lost any sense of why they are reading student work. And you can't give the kind of line by line insights that would really help someone develop as a writer that I can do for, I don't know, probably 8 people at a time maximum. And that's my job in order to keep track of where they've been, where they are weak, where they're strong, how we try to bring their writing to the next level. I do that with adults, but it's not possible to do that, and it's not rewarded. There's no reason for teachers to do that. Their incentives don't align with that either. They can provide the most interesting feedback and even create more great writers, but when you make the B plus writer an A minus writer, it doesn't have enough payoff for either of you to have been worth the effort. But if you assign a kid to write a letter targeting his parents to try to extend his curfew, could that be done with AI? Yes. Is it much easier for him to see how the pieces of credibility and persuasion work together to deliver a message that has meaning to the child? You know, it can be done better and worse, but it can only be done really well at small scale, which is one of the problems all classrooms face.
Let's talk about good writing for a minute because I want to define this. This is a thing that gets skirted around and referenced all of the time. Kids need to learn good writing. They need to learn good writing skills. They need to be good writers. And it requires a definition before we get too far in the weeds of assuming we're all on the same page about what this means. What in your mind is good writing, and what is this thing that we should be striving towards when we are helping our kids learn to write? What is this holy grail that we're chasing?
So there are two views on this, as all things in academics, right? There is technically excellent writing, where you are not making what people generally consider to be the mistakes of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's effective writing. And these are two different pursuits. In terms of getting your message across, intelligibility is the only rule, and everything else is classism. Right? So as a professional writer, if you can be understood, if your reader is invested, it's accessible, the material, you can follow it all the way through, and then at the end, you want to do whatever it is that the writer chose for you to do. There's a classic story, I'm not going to remember the names, but that in the forum, right, one orator stands up and gives a speech, and everybody looks at each other and says, "Wow, he is such a talented speaker." But when Demosthenes finishes, they say, "We must march." They are no longer paying attention to the art form, the correctness. They have been motivated by the purpose toward the action that the writer intended. They now see something differently and are moved to behave in the world in this new way. What the nerds at the university would call, why has it just gone out of my head? It's performative writing. So it's a speech act, something that can cause change in the world in the way that you intended. Now, you could easily create a different perlocutionary effect, as we say, in the reader. They could read what you wrote and do exactly the opposite because they have been so turned off to the idea that now I'm not going to go vote when I was before. Um, so whether it can be understood and taken on board by the reader and then create that change that is the purpose that the author intended. Those are the tools of good writing. But rhetorical reasoning, which is a lot of what we're trying to teach, especially to high schoolers and college students, serve you well in every sphere of your life. The ability to look at your own thinking on the page is such an important part of writing well. Distinguishing correlation from cause, right? Putting things in meaningful schema so you can provide detail without overwhelming the reader. Being aware of our selection biases, recognizing cognitive dissonance. So these, I believe both of these paragraphs, but I can't put them right next to each other because they seem to contradict. Not that you can't include them both, but I'm missing some connective tissue here. And I need to make it clear that this is a concession to a counterargument, but this one takes precedence and priority, and I need to rearrange the paragraphs so that that progression is clear. Investigating other perspectives and counterarguments, understanding why someone would disagree with you. This skill of cognitive empathy is maybe hugely missing from our current political moment also, to understand how someone could be smart and well-reasoned and also disagree with you. As somebody who ghostwrites a lot, I write for people work that I agree with and feel passionately about, and work that I don't feel passionately about, or I feel passionately and I disagree. And that's okay. I actually write better for people I don't immediately align with because it's in my interest to find all of the weak spots in the argument. I'm the one steel manning the straw man. And I see all the weaknesses and I want to fortify the argument. And then I have to go in search of new evidence, not that persuades me, but that will persuade my eventual audience that this is the most valid form of an argument, even I disagree with. You can construct something really rhetorically powerful, even if it isn't a mode of self-expression, through the enhancement of rhetorical reasoning skills. So that is what composition in the university, composition courses, was intended to do, to put you in conversation with text and encourage you to break down arguments, find out how they work, replicate them where possible, in the same way that an early drawing student will trace great masters. You develop some muscle memory for building a strong argument by looking at how other people do it and taking it apart. And then you want to be able to enhance it and embroider it and create all kinds of things that make it uniquely your own. But first, it has to function, right? You can decorate your bike all you want, but first, you better understand how everything fits together or it's not going to roll, right? So the purpose-driven bicycle, like the purpose-driven essay, first must deliver, right? And find how it does what it does, and then you can make it artistically interesting. Which is also why we rely on the 5-paragraph essay so much, because it is an encapsulation of the way we create good arguments. Even though it's not fun to read, and we rarely in the real world write them, it is a way of practicing the skills of what makes the bike go forward until you find something you care about.
Do you think the 5-paragraph essay is a useful exercise for
I
a
do.
student to learn how to do? You do.
I do. I find the 5-paragraph essay very useful in training that muscle memory, and it's an accessible amount of text. Editing an argument over a 30-page paper is extremely difficult. It requires multiple levels of outlining, and then you're dealing with actual structure. What subheadings should this function, and how does it, right? If you can take a lot of that pressure away by making it something short and slightly formulaic, right? Introductory paragraph, 3 elements of logic that should lead you to a conclusion. Figuring out how to do that is learning the mechanics of the bike. So yes, it is useful in the same way that bike repair is useful to the cyclist. Understanding how it works helps you create something interesting later and effective.
What do you think the correct parameters are for the amount of effort that should be expended into writing 5-paragraph essays? Do you think it's useful in the context of like you should do this a couple times and kind of understand the mechanics, or do you think it's something that is useful for students to drill on? Because you also run the risk of students getting stuck at the 5-paragraph essay and thinking that is the extent of what writing is, or getting burnt out on them to the point that they decide they don't like writing and they don't want to do it anymore.
Right. Like most practice, you should be mixing it up with other things, right? If you only practice jump shots, you will get good at jump shots and nothing else will improve, right? So you want to mix up the exercises. You should be writing different kinds of things. The fact that 5-paragraph essays are one of the few things we actually require students to write is one of the reasons that they get stuck because they haven't tried a lot of other things. They haven't tried a lot of other structures. There are many interesting structures, even for an essay of that length. You decide, I'm going to write a logical progression essay of this length. You could still do it any number of ways. Ideally, you could do the same purpose driven argument to try to accomplish something in several different ways and see which works. So now you have some comparison among your skills. Oh, I could strengthen this, but I don't really need to use this tool. This isn't getting me further with my audience. This isn't appropriate to the topic. But that judgment comes from having tried it a bunch of times. So more than 2, fewer than 20.
One of the things that I often notice in students coming out of a conventional education path, whether they are coming out of high school or whether they're coming out of university, who have been deemed good writers, is that there is a very heavy academic overtone to everything that they are writing. And it's very inaccessible to the average reader, because not because the average reader can't understand it, although sometimes that's also true. They're using words that are so heavy and convoluted that it's not worth the effort necessary to expend to understand it for someone to go, okay, I get what you're trying to say. But when you're trying to translate your thoughts to the mind of another person who's living in a busy world where they don't have tons of time to expend trying to decide if your argument is even worth spending time on, let alone whether or not they agree with you, you're never going to get through to somebody. And so if you're writing someone a 5-paragraph email about why they should hire you, or you're posting a 5-paragraph essay on Twitter or on Facebook arguing a point that you really think everyone you're connected to should understand because you think it's really important. I know I'm kind of harping on the 5-paragraph essay, but you're writing, maybe it's not 5 paragraphs, but it's written using very academic terms and very academic structure. No one is going to read it because it requires a total context shift from how one normally speaks and reads and writes in the real world back to what you were doing in school, which felt like this really artificial environment that you kind of knew even then didn't have a real world application. So people are coming out of school thinking they're good writers, but they're writing in a way that's extremely inaccessible and extremely ineffective because it's not catering to where the audience is. And if your goal is to either convey a thought or convince someone of something, you have to meet them where they are as the starting point. And so I am often inclined to think that a conventional writing education that is considered to be good and you're considered to be a good writer
Can be a
is actually
liability.
detrimental. Like it's actually teaching you a bunch of things that you have to unlearn later. And I imagine you see this all the time working as an editor.
Sure. And academic prose is nobody's first language, which means this is a thing we do to people and then later have to undo. Right? Some of them are doing it intuitively because that's what they've been exposed to. Others have been taught to write in this really inaccessible way. And again, we go back to what is the purpose? The purpose of even the best academic writing is never to appeal to a broad audience. Rarely
No.
is it to convince anyone of anything. It is to demonstrate a form of specialized niche expertise. There is no more niche audience than a tier one research university. You are ideally writing for the 9 other people in your field who care about this and who already share many of your assumptions about how things should be presented and a jargon based vocabulary that allows you to be really specific, or in many cases, allows you to talk around an issue without having to address it directly. The power of the passive voice in scientific writing, right, is an attempt to force objectivity onto something that is inherently self-representative and so political in the broad sense, right? Even what you've tried to include. So the prose that is trying to seem objective and erudite and worthy of admission into this tiny academic club, you could argue that academic prose is serving its purpose. The purpose just doesn't have very much to do with good writing. But yes, there are also paths out. I will recommend always and broadly the Paramedic method of editing. So you can get it on the Purdue OWL, which is an online writing lab of Purdue University. The Paramedic method is a great step-by-step option for rescuing your prose from academic voice. What if I figured out first what's happening in this sentence and then wrote it as if it were happening? Instead of later reporting as objectively and bloodlessly as possible that something might have happened. So picking up an active voice and meeting your reader in the kinds of prose they actually consume, that writing well in the wrong medium is very common, right? It's hard to say what good prose is, but good prose is not good on social media.
Mm-mm.
You could put up Orwell quotes all day. They will be less effective than they were in the essay he developed them for. So I don't know that social media in general supports good writing, or good habits of writing. And on some level, we would expect that because the purposes are not aligned with good writing and your audience is being fed your content instead of needing to seek it out or be justified in investing their time in it. So if it's going to be served to someone, you can be a little more cavalier with trying to engage your reader.
Are there, because there are so many different categories of writing that one can try to master. One can try to master a format that will allow them to be published in publications, whether they're, mainstream top tier publications or whether they're, the publications of think tanks or, something more specialized to their field of interest, that they can try to optimize their writing for publication. They can try to optimize it for convincing a very busy audience, doing something like email writing, which can also be quality prose, but requires an entirely different format in order to convince a reader both of your credibility and that your ideas are worth thinking about in the first place, and then convincing them ultimately, ideally, of your conclusion,
What a
whether that they
powerful
should.
rhetorical tool skipping a line can be, right?
Mhm.
White space is so important to the way we actually consume information, and it is not something that is generally taught along with good writing.
No, it's encouraged against.
Yes.
Um, But there are so many different types of writing that can be mastered. And one of the things that is important in the learning of the craft of writing is learning first to think about who your audience is, what you're trying to convey to them or convince them of or get them to do, and what the best mechanism is for doing that. So there's this exercise in thought that is first and foremost figuring out, who am I talking to and why am I talking to them? Who am I talking to and what do I want them to do? Or like what is the benefit of saying something to them?
That's right.
And then there's the thought process that's also required in taking the things that are in your head that might be really great thoughts, but probably need a lot of organization to be compelling and clear and both accessible to someone else, but also not full of holes that need to be addressed and shored up. And so there are different thinking exercises. Once you start thinking about writing as an applied art form and an applied skill set, there are so many different ways of thinking that you have to start developing to be able to do this well. But writing also is in and of itself a valuable tool for thinking, even if you aren't trying to be published anywhere or convince anyone of anything. The act of writing is still valuable.
Yes. You can be your own audience and you will get a benefit out of it.
Yes. Can you talk about this a little bit? Because I think this is something that people undervalue when they think about writing. They think about it as an external, extrinsically motivated activity
Mhm.
because you learn it in the context of doing it for someone else.
Yes.
But if you never wrote for a single person, you never let your writing see the light of day for the rest of your life, although I would encourage you to find an editor because that does help your thought process significantly. But if your writing never sees the light of day, it would still be a beneficial activity. And I think it's certainly lost on the way we teach kids writing.
Yes.
But I think it's also like most people don't spend their time writing because they don't think it's useful.
It is a tool for clarifying your own thinking. And writing, like the process of creating the self, is iterative and imperfect and alive. And sometimes things fall apart and you have to pin them back up. But it is very much the way we conceive of ourselves as an audience. So school trains you to look for an authority, somebody who authorized your work, who rewarded it and approved of you and noticed. Yeah, I notice you're unsurprised, nodding, right? This is how school works, right? It is authority based. How do I please an authority? If you choose yourself as your audience and you want to create something that works well for you, then you have a chance to really enhance the way your mind works, partly by capturing it, right? If you wanted to work on your golf swing, you might videotape it and you capture that transient moment and you can analyze it. So writing works that way to capture the contents of your thinking so you can examine it and see where it falls apart. The mind is a wonderful tool, but it's an unreliable one. And we should be doubling and triple checking the logic problems and the conclusions, even the ones that seem natural and obvious. And what are our assumptions? And reality, even the reality of our own inner world, is seldom as straightforward as we expect once we start looking carefully. And your brain is programmed to solve relatively easy questions fast. Can I walk through this tree trunk? Nope, I tried that once. I know this is true of all trees. I cannot walk through it, right? It doesn't give you the impulse to try a different way or to try to persuade yourself to build these skills or a growth mindset. How far away is the lion? How likely is this berry to kill me? Your brain is working on a relatively short timeline trying to keep you alive. And we are more or less adept at answering those specific kinds of questions. But once we get into anything more interesting, let alone something like, who am I and what do I have to offer the world? You'll want to take more than one swing at that question. And you won't want to assume that the question that you, or the answer that felt really natural when you were 14 will still feel natural at 20. But capturing our own thinking allows us to refine the ideas and the way we process information, come to better conclusions. I am consistently reminding both young students and older authors that revision is not a punishment. It's a reward. Once you get something interesting down, then you can re-envision it and create something even stronger or more compelling. And that's very much the sort of relationship we have with our sense of self over our lifetimes. We're going to scratch some drafts, and we should, right? Well, I tried that and that definitely didn't work. I won't make that mistake again. Only new mistakes, right? But if you've written that down and you have a sense of how you came to a conclusion, then you have a chance of heading yourself off next time before you make that mistake. If you don't stop to examine how your thinking process works, I'm a compulsive journaler, right? So I will take what feels like a muddy and spinning mind and try to create a linear narrative out of it. I find it's not linear at all. Once I rearrange it so that it falls in some sort of linear pattern, then I see where I've gone wrong or what I've failed to consider, or all of this is hinging on this particular assumption. What evidence do I have for this assumption? What counter evidence do I have for this assumption? How could I know if either was true? I'm sure I wasn't invited to that party because they don't want me there. Doesn't have you write the same email than, I believe I may have been overlooked on this RSVP list. I feel like this is an appropriate place for me to be. Why don't I go test the assumption that they don't want me there? How could I do that? Well, I'll ask the hostess. Oh, it turns out it was just an oversight. Right? So you can prevent your own growth if you're not willing to look at the ways your mind is providing automatic conclusions through heuristics, which are more or less reliable and will change at different times in your life. So the ability to capture your own thinking and then subject it to some sort of logical analysis is the best argument, I would say, for writing's sake, is that it allows you to examine the quality of your thinking.
There's also the argument of using writing to grapple with other people's thinking and come to your own conclusions about it, which is what some of school writing is attempting to do.
Yes,
But
originally was intended to do.
but students don't always realize that's what's happening,
Right.
and I think this is a skill set that people dramatically underappreciate. If I'm listening to a podcast episode and I hear someone make an argument that I know is incorrect, because obviously they know it's correct, so, there's some subjectivity going on here, but I listen to it and I go, "I don't agree with that," and I have a very strong opinion on why I don't. I get this impulse to sit down and write about it because I know that if I force myself to take what they said, dissect it, compare it to these other things about the world that I know are true, I can simultaneously clarify why I disagree with something, but also make sure I can identify the holes in my own logic, because some things are going to feel intuitive to me because I've seen enough evidence and heard enough anecdotes that I know that unilaterally the thing that this person said is not a universal experience. It's not as true as they're making it sound. But I can't just pull out 3 citations off the tip of my tongue and give them as a retort if I was talking to this person, because I've never done the work to really clarify my thinking about this. But if I hear something that sparks enough interest where I'm bothered enough by what somebody said that I really need to think about it and think about why they seem so wrong to me, I'm going to do a better job if I write about it. And this is true. Like, sometimes I get the urge to do this when people leave unpleasant comments to me on social media or podcast guest appearances or something,
You
and they're like,
still
"You're
reading the
stupid for
comments?
these
This is the
reasons."
key mistake. Don't read the
No, because
comments.
sometimes well, I'm careful about it. I don't if they're actually bothering me, I don't read them. But sometimes they're useful because I don't agree with the person, but they are pointing out somewhere where my logic wasn't clear enough
Yes.
to convince them. And I don't operate under the assumption that I'm going to change their mind, but perhaps I can frame this in a better way the next time so that what I'm saying is clearer to a broader audience of people. And I think that, you know, the practice of doing this is you're sort of inviting yourself into the great conversation, which is all people across all time writing about the things they're thinking about and the ideas that they're exploring and contributing a very small piece to this very broad swath of collective human knowledge, which is how we got to where we are. And when you start digging into the history of literature, it's really all just a bunch of philosophers arguing with each other in chronological order, where they're debating why the person who came before them was wrong and then critiquing it and providing a different conclusion that they think is better. And we very slowly throughout human history are refining our understanding of who we are and what we're doing in the universe and how this world we live in works by going through this process. And that's a game you can play too, and it's useful to you. And I don't think we do a very good job exposing students to that. I don't think the average person realizes how powerful that exercise is.
Being in conversation with the texts? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The classical metaphor is the Burkean parlor, right? You walk into a busy intellectual parlor and there's already a whole bunch of conversations going on and you get to witness little bits being added on. You can't really understand the experiences of the people who've already been there, and people will leave before you, and at some point you have to get up and leave. You can't stay. So, what do you want to put forward into this group of thinking people while you have the chance, knowing that the conversation will go on long after you and someone might remember something that you said? So, yeah, the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse, right? If we can see ourselves as participants in a human conversation, which is also not very supported by school. So, we have the sage on the stage or the guide on the side. These are the two teaching mechanisms, right? And you have sage on the stage for the first many years of a student's academic career. They are recipients of knowledge. They're not participants in the creation of knowledge, which is what education was meant to do, was equip us as participants in the process of knowledge creation, including bouncing off each other and refining ideas. And okay, if that were true, I don't think it is, but what would we expect to see in the world? And then do we see that? And if we don't, what else could we look for that would tell us whether we were looking in the right place? It's intellectual pursuits in the same way that physics is, right? Can we design an experiment that would put these two variables up against each other head to head and show us which one works? And so we don't think about writing that way, maybe until college, maybe not even then, that we are participating in trying to refine ideas, and also that you can argue with the people who came before you. And that we have been, as a species, remarkably dumb for most of human history, right? Like, you should wash your hands before you stick them in someone's open wound is really new knowledge, like shockingly new knowledge. But it's possible we wouldn't have come to it had people not been writing down their observations of what was happening in maternity wards and then comparing them to places where midwives washed their hands regularly. And okay, now we've learned something about the universe that we didn't know before. It seems like this hand washing thing has legs. Let's test it.
One of the things that you and I were talking about before we started recording is how much the standard of teaching writing has shifted over time. Like we have if you aspire to teach your kids the art of writing or encourage them to go to a higher education institution that's going to teach them the art of good writing, even that is a moving target. Like the standards keep changing. Can we talk about this a little bit? Because this is also really interesting.
And by changing, you mean falling?
Yeah.
So we've often noted before that the requirement to get into an Ivy League program in any discipline used to be fluency in either Latin or Greek, preferably both. That was considered to be the standard of student and how you proved yourself ready for serious intellectual discourse. Now, the Ivy League no longer even requires Latin and Greek fluency from their graduating classics majors. So we've vastly changed what we think the purpose of teaching young people to write is. I think it's probably more realistic than expecting that they needed fluency in Latin and Greek. That's probably not tremendously relevant. But in the same way, if you graduated an entire college program without ever having used AI as a writing tool or a writing partner, you also probably missed something important about the way you're going to interact with prose for the rest of your life. So we don't expect as much of citizens, and so we don't place value on reading and writing and participating in the civic conversation in the way I think, especially in this country, it was common to do. The standards of writing for young people from 100 years ago will knock your socks off. And we tend to think it must be because the language is staid or dated that it's hard for us to understand. But even a modern sort of translation is more than most people have an appetite for. That's partly because we've killed their love of learning through the school system. And it benefits the school system to do this, right? Curious isn't good. Receptive is good. You will be supplied what you need. Don't go looking for it. The system that teaches people to relate to knowledge that way is not on their team, right? Those people do not want the better of you. And maybe that's part of why the standards fall. I don't want to go full conspiracy theory, that the system doesn't want you to write well or think well, that the state dumbs down education and censors information deliberately to weaken people's minds and to empower itself as the provider of right and good. But it doesn't hurt. It hasn't hurt them. It's difficult to see how, if that were their intent, they would operate differently. Because if you can write well, really well, you can change minds. Minds change social conditions. They rise up against bad ideas. They challenge structures. As much lip service as we pay to overthrowing the system in education, it isn't in the educational system's interest to provide you with the tools to do that. Right? Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never disassemble the master's house. So if you look at something like, I want to write a letter about why I should be able to leave high school at 16, take a GED sort of test, and call myself a high school graduate. If you can do that really successfully, you can emancipate yourself from a system, which is also what Jefferson was doing, and what Hamilton was doing, and what Madison was doing with their power of writing. We've read all this stuff about the way the world works, and we think we can do better. And we want to try this, right? And so we'll write this declaration, King George, we don't need your help anymore, thanks, bye. We'll just be going now. And then they write new systems into existence with careful consideration of the classical tradition. And Locke and Hume, and they're like looking at the ideas about what's gone wrong in monarchy. Why doesn't it serve the people like we think it should? And writing a new reality in this really literal sense. It makes sense that we don't set up schools to do that anymore. It doesn't benefit the system to teach people to question it, which is one of many problems with letting the government educate children.
Yeah, one of just a few. There's also it's not just a decline in the ability to read, though. It's all, or sorry, to write. It's also a decline in the ability to comprehend and the ability to your point about the writing skills of children a century ago are shocking. That writing was intended for, like, not only could most people write that way, most people could read that way. There was a comprehension component, and I reference this a lot when talking about literacy in the pre-public school era. In the revolutionary times, as you just referenced, we also had a very high literacy rate without the existence of any public education whatsoever. And that literacy rate, it's not just that people could read, they could read at a very high comprehension level, because these things that the founding fathers were writing, like the Federalist Papers, John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they were writing for the layperson to convince them that
Right.
the Constitution they were creating should be adopted. And if you pick up the Federalist Papers, it's work to read compared to a lot of what is in our world today. A lot of college graduates would have a hard time with those texts. And it's not just that the words are archaic, it's that the structure of logic is complex. So we've lost the ability, we've lost the muscle of grappling with difficult ideas.
And I guess you could blame that on writers to some extent. We've made it too easy for readers over
Well,
the years. We don't challenge.
but there's a balance here, because you also have to read something that someone's going to, you have to write something that someone's going to read. So if you go, this is a problem, I'm going to start writing harder things, no one's going to read them. Like, we also have to play the game as a writer of convincing someone that this is an argument worth listening to and that this is worth their time and their effort. And the more accessible you make something, the more likely that is to happen. So there's this sort of duality where you simultaneously are rewarded for writing things that are rewarded in a positive sense, not just like a social structure sense. You're going to get a better outcome if you write something that's more accessible. But there's also something that we're losing along the way. And it seems sort of like a catch-22.
And there's an appetite for complexity that's missing. And I see it, have seen it in my own life. My written attention span is waning. It's harder to sit down and read at length and grapple with a complex text than it used to be. We are interrupted more continuously, and we're accustomed to information being fed to us at a
Mhm.
certain pace.
Yeah,
And so
the
the
Twitter
desire
thread,
to go
280 characters at a time.
stay off of Twitter if you want to write well or
Or
have
don't
faith
stay
in
off of Twitter if you
humanity.
want to read all my spicy thoughts. Anyway, continue.
The only reason to be on Twitter is Hannah Frank.
There are a couple other good ones, but
Certainly. You're retweeting the good ones, right? That you can be
some
my
of
whole
them.
content universe.
I won't say no.
I think it was easier to convince people that these writings had an effect on their daily lives, too, that the outcome, reading Common Sense, right? He was the bestseller of his day, Thomas Paine, but if you sense that you're going to understand why your country is about to go to war, you might have an incentive to dive in. And it's hard to find that kind of high stakes writing anymore. Even the State of the Union is like nonsense, right? The content that one could grapple with has been removed from serious consideration. We are not expected to wrestle with big ideas. Kids are not given even the literacy, that's a loaded term, but you ought to understand something about Greek mythology, and you ought to understand something about the symbolism in the Bible, and you ought to understand something about the process of, creating post-apocalyptic fiction, right? If you have a reasonable literacy of these different ways of interacting with the world, then you can write much more richly, but you can also consume more interesting texts, because the idea of Icarus is conveyed in a word, but only if you know who Icarus is and what might have been on his mind. So as we lose the sort of commonality, and I do struggle with the literacy rate in the colonial period because we have an evolving sense of what qualified as people. And so it's hard to get statistics that include everyone we would want to include now, including everyone that gets sent to public school. When education was much more tied to class, to the privilege of free time to pursue ideas, where it was unique to language, right? You can be considered illiterate in the United States, even if you are perfectly literate in, say, German or Spanish. Are you accustomed culturally to the kinds of texts that are being written for you? Right. So there's a lot more diversity across all of those things. I would argue to the good, but it's hard for us to decide what the really important stuff to be reading and grappling with is as such a diverse nation. And some people try, right? That's why we're still reading The Grapes of Wrath and As I Lay Dying, because we have an appetite for a national canon, but not much commonality in what that canon should consist of. It's the reason we've all read The Scarlet Letter, because there isn't an American literary tradition before Mark Twain, but you can't teach that in schools, right? Like, it's mostly British up until this point, and then we have a uniquely American voice. But you got to come up with a novel from that century, so we've all read that one, whether it was important to wrestle with or not. But would kids benefit more from reading selections from the Federalist Papers? Yes. Is there an appetite to do that in schools? Not really.
In spite of all of this, so in spite of the fact that we live in a world that makes grappling with big ideas feel irrelevant and unnecessary, and in spite of the fact that writing complex tracts narrows the audience of people who are going to read them, you would still advocate for the challenging of oneself to do these things,
Yes.
correct?
Yes. And the betterment of oneself is a separate goal. We are not inclined to view our sense of self as something we actively produce. But if you accept that part, then all of these become productive pursuits, because
What
what
about
you're producing is a better mind.
what about in a practical sense? The not only the betterment of oneself, which is a compelling goal to many, but not more compelling than getting a better job, furthering one's career, supporting one's family, putting food on the table. What in the practical sense do you see as being, because I think this is an important argument to make to convince people this is a worthy endeavor. What are the practical benefits that you see as someone who interacts with writers all the time, reads other people's writing, is writing yourself, that being good at these things can offer in one's actual day-to-day life?
Yes. I would discourage you from trying to separate those things, because the toolbox of writing does make it easier to put food on the table, does make it better, not necessarily easier, but more meaningful to engage with one's family or one's nation. Um, if we look at the things that are actually important to us to do and change and start writing there, that is, I would say, the way to get through it. So rather than starting with the esoteric and reading the Federalist Papers, juicy as they are, Do you have a capacity to influence an audience to change that? If no, get smaller, right? Do less better is generally good advice for all kinds of writing. We try to do too much in the space allowed, and so we can't do any of it very well. But if you do a little bit less, figure out what it is you actually do have an audience for and could convince them of, and try to get better at writing whatever that is, right? Maybe it is your mini sermon for Sunday school, or it is a letter to your HOA about that lot that makes you crazy, or it is even a letter to the editor of the newspaper, right? Preferably for something that readers of that newspaper have some capacity to change. Writing to the editor of your local paper about a national policy is likely to frustrate you, even if it makes you a slightly better writer. So I would go back, as we do, to purpose and audience. What do you want to accomplish? And then what tools do you need in your writing toolbox to do that specific small thing, and build up from there. And if you're looking to engage your writing skills, ask any organization that's doing something interesting that you care about what they need written. And I promise you, there is something on the bottom of the monthly meeting agenda that they've been kicking down the road, right? We do need the text for that email donations appeal in December, though. Or we do need to produce a new brochure next year, but no one wants to write it. Figure out what you would like to make a difference doing, and then find out what the writing task attached to that is. And you don't have to start creating an audience from scratch, although there is a lot of positivity in branding and creating an audience that is receptive specifically to what you have to say. Find an audience that exists already, the recipients of your HOA newsletter, that can make a change that is valuable to you, and then write something that can persuade them, and then rewrite it, and then rewrite it, and then let someone read it, right? So these are all steps that writers get stuck on separately, right? I've written it, but I haven't revised it. I've revised it, but I don't want anybody to read it yet. I let my editor read it, but it doesn't feel ready to publish yet. At some point, right? Spend it all. More will
Mhm.
follow.
For parents who are listening to this, who are convinced by what you're saying that teaching their children to write is good and important and is a perennially valuable part of their education. I know it's a very broad question, but do you have recommendations, either things that you like, tools or habits or practices that you think are particularly helpful for teaching the craft of writing, or resources that you recommend and love, or even just sort of a baseline of here's how to think about exposing your kids to good writing over the course of their education in a way that will be beneficial to them? I know that's a huge question, but whatever comes to mind, and you can take that anywhere you'd like.
Exposing them to good writing comes from reading. Not only reading to them, but reading yourself and being seen reading yourself. So I make an effort to take paper books out of the library, even though that is not my preference, because I would rather have it digitally and take notes. But I know it's important for my daughter to see me reading for pleasure and for work. And so I do it in this symbolic way to help her see that it's important to what I do for a living. And she sees screens full of words all the time, but the the idea of linearly consuming and producing something a surprisingly underrated technique for teaching your children to write is encouraging your children to write. So we have a lot of investment in teaching how, but we don't actually ask them to practice the skills all that often. In the same way that you can take a public speaking class that doesn't include a presentation component. You can't become a much better writer by listening to someone else tell you about writing. You instead get better by doing it, failing, trying something else, trying again. Or people tell me, oh, yeah, man, I wish I could write. Like, you can. That is within your power. It is one of the few things that requires almost no equipment. You could start your novel today if you wish. Generally, what they mean is they wish writing were easier. And that's fine, right? And don't be afraid to chunk things. You don't have to sit down and, write the whole thing at one time. And in fact, writing generally benefits from breathing room. It's important that you forget what you meant to say so that you can later read what you've said and see if it holds up to what your original idea was. But encourage kids to write, encourage them to write letters and not formulaic thank you notes, but to try to put something of themselves into conveyance to another human being, right? You want to create ideas in the next mind and then hopefully create action in that next mind, right? If you have written something powerful and they read it and say, wow, that was well written, it probably wasn't. Or you haven't zeroed in on what the purpose should have been. So give your kids concrete audience and purpose and let them write and rewrite. There are a lot of great books. Stephen King's On Writing. I'm not a Stephen King fan. That book is amazing. As far as conceiving of the craft of writing in a way that we never master, but continue to grapple with more competently throughout our lifetime. It's always a little bit of a battle. Even I, don't love writing. I really love having written. And I enjoy editing a lot. And that is something that I've been able to make a living in, partly because most people hate looking at their own work. And I would like to try to figure out what interesting thing you were saying and then present it in the best possible way for your purpose and audience as you have stated them. So practicing. Yeah. Anne Lamott's On Writing, Bird by Bird is her book. On Writing is excellent. George Orwell's Politics of the English Language is a short essay. Can recommend to everyone. Shitty First Drafts, also Anne Lamott, is a good. Giving yourself permission to write something. Oh, should we have bleeped that? You'll bleep that for me later. Okay.
It's fine.
I think it's printed with an asterisk in most college textbooks. But also letting your kids argue with you is a good start to writing. Let them make a case for something they believe strongly in, even if you know they won't change your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more accessible skills, especially at the student level, than we generally want to let on. But it doesn't require a lot of formality or structure. It requires a lot of repetition and iteration to write well.
If people have enjoyed this conversation, and I'm quite sure they have, and they want to know more about you or read more of your work, where would you send them next?
They can reach me through thatghostwriter.com. And I am currently the managing editor at the American Institute for Economic Research. So lots of my content there and content that I've edited and trying to make complex, unwieldy, scholarly ideas really accessible to the everyman. So if you're looking for content to read and to challenge yourself and you're not ready for the Federalist Papers, try thedailyeconomy.org.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was a pleasure, as always.
Always wonderful to talk to you, Hannah.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.